Hello, everyone. Joseph Holbrook here. I'm still in Maryland for a few more days. I'm recording again on our ongoing series on modern American history from 1877. Today we have arrived at the fabulous 1970s, which I remember well. And the title of today's lecture in this week's chapter is The Unraveling. So the basic idea here is that the tumult of the 1960s, the assassinations culminating in the riots at the Democratic National Convention, a lot of race riots around the country, and a number of, as I've mentioned, a number of assassinations, the sexual revolution, the drug problems, all of this led to a period of instability and unraveling in which the culture war was heating up, and the pendulum was swinging back and forth, liberal and conservative, left and right. And this culminates a period called the liberal consensus that began around, I would suppose, 1933 with the election of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to the presidency of the United States. That began a period of consensus around commitment to liberal values, even with Republican presidents like Dwight Eisenhower tended to govern moderately rather than conservatively, and Eisenhower made no attempts to roll back the New Deal legislation of the 1940s. And so with the election of John Kennedy, and then later with the Great Society legislation under Lyndon B. Johnson, this was the high point of the liberal consensus. And then after Johnson, you had, like I said, the Vietnam War, assassinations, riots, corruption. All of that led to a very ambiguous period in the 1970s, which our textbook is calling the Unraveling. So we're going to talk about that today. And then we'll continue on next week with the conservative revolution under Reagan. So a story that perfectly illustrates this period of time of unraveling began in December 1969, at the very end of the 1960s. It was a rock concert in Altamonte Springs in California. It was intended to be the Woodstock of the West, which happened about a year earlier. Woodstock was idealized as a place of peace and love and nonviolence and drugs, happy drugs, and good vibes, but Altamonte was something very different. So what happened in Altamonte is that the organizers headlined the attraction with the Rolling Stones and a number of other bands. They tried to save some money by, instead of hiring police security, they hired the Hells Angels to do security for the rock concert by giving them free beer. What could go wrong? A group of Hells Angels with cue sticks and free beer. What could possibly go wrong with that? And so it just was poorly managed, poorly organized. People were getting tense. The show was running behind. A young black man tried to climb up to see to get a better view of the stage. Some Hells Angels attacked him. He pulled out a gun in self-defense, and so the Hells Angels beat him to death and stabbed him. And this was a terrible nightmare. It was a fiasco, and this was a contrast to Woodstock, which had happened a year earlier. The young man's name was Meredith Hunter. So Altamonte became the dark mirror to Woodstock, and it kind of illustrates the beginning of a terrible unraveling of chaos. Of course, the chaos had already been going on during the 1960s But the 1970s, an anxious conservative mood began to settle in across the nation, according to our author. The nation had gone too far, a lot of people felt, unfairly trampling the rights of one group to promote the selfish needs of another group. It seemed as if the nation was ready to unravel. I'll put this together with the strain of Vietnam. I remember myself participating in some protests against Vietnam. This led to a sense of anger at the government, a sense of disillusionment that the government lied to the American people, and that our government was committing atrocities, thinking of the My Lai massacre, and lying to the American public about it. There were daily body counts. The war aims were hazy and ambiguous. The draft catalyzed the anti-war movement, which is probably a reason why we haven't seen one since then, since the draft was abolished. I suppose if we ended up in war in the Ukraine with Russia and instituted a draft, we might get some protests finally. There was protests throughout Europe as well as the United States. Protesters burned draft cards. They refused to pay income taxes. By the way, the first person to do that was Henry David Thoreau at Weldon Pond when the United States government went to war with Mexico to acquire territory. He refused to pay his taxes and was sent to jail. The first anti-war protester around 1837, 1840. By 1967, anti-war demonstrations were drawing hundreds of thousands, including myself. I spent an evening trapped on the Ohio State University Oval, and I had to sleep on a park bench because we were surrounded by the National Guard. In one protest, hundreds of people were arrested after surrounding the Pentagon. Here's a picture of an empty building, kind of symbolizing the economic unraveling of that period. Here's Vietnam War protesters at the 1967 March on the Pentagon. And another reason besides the draft why the war was so unpopular was it was the first living room war. The military made the mistake of not censoring war coverage. When I say mistake, I'm using that tongue in cheek. And they allowed reporters to unobstructed access to the battle scenes and to take photographs. Television, print media, and open access to the battlefield provided unprecedented coverage of the war's brutality. Americans were confronted daily by grisly images of casualties and atrocities. For example, in 1965, the CBS Evening News aired a segment discussing the massacre of the My Lai villagers, 500 villagers killed, women and children killed under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, who claimed he was following orders. This kind of stuff shocked the American public, who was not used to it. So another thing that happened was, let me back up. And so this was a living room war. People were seeing these terrible images on TV on a nightly basis. Now, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military wised up in the 20th century, and they invited reporters to accompany the troops, and they embedded the reporters in with their units. So if you're a reporter covering the war in Iraq, you're in a unit, you're depending on that unit to keep you alive. You kind of become part of the unit, and so there's much more pressure to give positive coverage of your unit, and so this works as sort of a subtle, indirect form of censorship by embedding reporters with the units instead of allowing reporters to wander around and get their own stories. So the military wised up and learned how to deal with that. The Tet Offensive happened in 1968, also along with the My Lai massacre. There was repeated claims, despite repeated claims of administration officials, the enemy could strike anywhere at any time in the country. This was proven by the Tet Offensive. In 1969, Seymour Hersh, a reported journalist who had has broken numerous stories over the years, he broke open the story of the My Lai massacre. He revealed that troops had raped or massacred hundreds of civilians in the village of My Lai. And here, this is not the village of My Lai, but this is a famous picture of some children who were burned by napalm. When the napalm was dropped on a village, the little girl in particular went viral. She had burns over her body. The reporter who took this picture, immediately after he took the picture, put away his camera, covered the little girl with his coat, put her in his car, and took her to a hospital. She survived. She later moved to the United States. She had something like 27 surgeries and skin grafts, and she currently lives, I think, in Canada, possibly, either Canada or the United States, and she actually is doing well in life. But you can see the horror on that little boy's face with his mouth open. It's just, these are the kind of images that shock Americans in the nightly news. Here is the guy who was running slideshow, front slide. This was Wisconsin Senator Eugene McCarthy. He was my favorite, my pick in the 1968 primaries for the election for president. He was running within the Democratic Party against the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, protesting the Vietnam War and calling for an end of the war. In the first primary in New Hampshire, President Johnson almost lost the primary, and Senator McCarthy came within a few points of defeating the sitting incumbent president of the United States in the very first primary. This led two things to happen. Bobby Kennedy then saw the vulnerability of Johnson in the politically, and he jumped into the race to run against both McCarthy and Johnson. And about a week later, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not be offering his name. He would not run for the nomination of President of the United States. He withdrew from the race, somewhat like Joe Biden this year. There's some differences, but there's some parallels between 1968 and 1924. I'm sorry, 1968 and 2024. So I was in high school, but I was an enthusiastic supporter of Eugene McCarthy because I was opposed to the war. Let's go back here. So, Johnson came within 200 votes of losing New Hampshire. Kennedy entered the race. This is in March, and also Johnson withdrew from the race. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. There were race riots in 6 cities. In June, Robert F. Kennedy was in California, I think on June 1st, campaigning for the Democratic nomination for president, and he was assassinated. April, MLK Jr., June, RFK. August was the riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. There's a great movie or dramatization of this event. I think it's on Netflix, and it's called The Chicago 7. I highly encourage you to watch it. It basically tells the story of what happened with the riots in Chicago, and 7 young men, 8 if you count the Black Panther leader, who were charged by the U.S. government with sedition and trying to overthrow the U.S. government. True story. I highly recommend it. Nixon, as a result of the upheaval among the Democrats and all the violence and the assassinations, Nixon was nominated by the Republicans. Hubert Humphrey, who had been vice president under Lyndon Johnson, won the nomination of the Democratic Party. Bobby Kennedy was dead. He beat out Senator McCarthy by a few votes and won the nomination, but went on to lose the race to Richard Nixon. And so then this brought Richard Nixon into power. It was a three-way race in 1968. It appeared like it might be in 2024. I keep going 19. I get stuck in the 19th century. 2024. We have RFK Jr., the son of RFK, is running as an independent. And we have, of course, Kamala Harris with the nomination for the Democratic candidacy. And we have Donald Trump nominated by the Republican Party, and RFK Jr. running as a potential spoiler or independent, although his poll numbers are not that great. In 1968, Nixon, I think, had about 43% of the vote. Humphrey had about 42%, and George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, got, I think, over 15%, and he actually won several electoral college votes. Let's see if we have it here. Nope, let's see it. But it was a close race, and it was a three-party race. So possibly Hubert Humphrey may have won if it hadn't been for George Wallace in the race. And let's go back one more. Here's a picture of Tricky Dick Nixon in campaigning. I don't remember where he's at here. But he's campaigning for the role of presidency, and he's giving lip service to ending the war. He was a hardline anti-communist, and of course when he gets elected he doesn't actually end the war. He keeps it going for another 5 years, unfortunately. Maybe a little bit less than 5 years. Here's a famous picture. This picture was taken either the same day or the day after I slept in the Oval at the Ohio State University campus. And this was a shooting at Kent State University, which is a few miles away from Ohio State University. The National Guard had live ammo in their guns, and something spooked them, and they started shooting and killed several students. Ohio National Guardsmen. So, this brings us to the Nixon years. The Nixon years. We're going to talk about Nixon's agenda, his attempts at détente, the war, Vietnam War, and the 1972 election and the Watergate corruption. So, Nixon asserted the supremacy of American democratic capitalism and believed that the United States should continue supporting its allies financially. He denounced the previous administration's willingness to commit American forces to third world conflicts and warned other states to assume responsibility for their own defense. We're hearing that now in this election. It's a shame we didn't really follow up when Nixon brought this up and actually implement an end to the endless wars. He was turning America away from a policy of active anti-communist containment towards a new strategy of détente. Détente is a word from French that means to stop or to slow down. Henry Kissinger was his national security advisor and later on became the Secretary of State. Kissinger was a realist in his international relations philosophy. As we'll see, Jimmy Carter was a liberal. Now, this is not politically liberal, but liberal in terms of international relations philosophy. Liberals believed in lots of in multilateralism and lots of international agencies and institutions to try to slow down and prevent the outbreak of war. Realists believe that every country operates in their own best interests, and best policy is not idealism, but hard-nosed realism when it comes to foreign relations. This was Henry Kissinger. Nixon became the first American president to visit communist China in 1971. And he was the first since Franklin Roosevelt to visit the Soviet Union. He visited in 1972. So this seemed to be Nixon's forte, is making these bold moves internationally. And because he was a hardline anti-communist, it made it easier for him to maneuver without being accused of selling out the United States. U.S.-Chinese relations were normalized and 2 U.S.-Soviet arms agreements were signed: the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Because of war in the Middle East, I believe it was the Yom Kippur War of 1973, in which Israel went to war with Syria and Egypt and beat them relatively quickly. A number of nations in the Middle East, led by Saudi Arabia, came together and formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. It was a cartel. A cartel is when a group of producers or competitors get together and agree not to compete, but to coordinate their policies in order to have greater clout, maybe to raise the prices. They became the world's leading oil producers. They embargoed oil exports to the United States as a tool of retaliation for American intervention in the Middle East. And this, in turn, created a chain of catalytic events that led to the first U.S. energy crisis. By the end of 1973, the global price of oil had quadrupled. That's when gasoline prices really started to go up. Richard Nixon went on television in November and warned Americans that the energy had become a serious national problem and that the United States was heading towards the most acute shortages of energy since World War II. During this time, there was also some recession brought on by the OPEC's withholding oil and raising the prices, and Nixon attempted wage and price controls, which is kind of a heresy for a conservative Republican president to attempt to do that. Most Republican conservatives would say that that kind of government, top-down government intervention could never work or be effective, and it was not. Another headache that Nixon had was the release of the Pentagon Papers. This is somewhat similar to Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks, only a number of years earlier. And Daniel Ellsberg was a high-up consultant in the intelligence industry, and he came across papers that proved that the United States government and the military had been lying to the American people all the way back to John Kennedy, even further back to Harry Truman, lying about Korea, lying about Vietnam. And so he took the documents that he had to the New York Times and the Washington Post and got them to publish the information. There was a damning history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam commissioned by the Defense Department and was leaked. So, 1973, the Congress, who had been stirred by these revelations, passed the War Powers Resolution, which forbade the president to initiate any military adventures without getting permission from Congress. In the Constitution, it's the U.S. Congress that's supposed to declare war, not the president. Nixon began to withdraw troops from Vietnam and attempted to strengthen the South Vietnamese troops to be able to stand up on their own against the Viet Cong. Unsuccessfully, by the way. So in 1972, when North Vietnam was dragging its feet about coming to the peace negotiation table, Nixon began bombing North Vietnam to try to pressure them, a little persuasion, to come to the negotiating table in Paris and negotiate a peace agreement. And it worked in a sense. In 1973, there was a peace agreement called the Paris Peace Accords. North Vietnam released all American prisoners of war, and the United States completed its military withdrawal from South Vietnam. And of course, this was predicated on the idea that South Vietnam would be able to defend itself